This is the Living Vertizontal podcast, brought to you by The Church at Riverstone, a fellowship of the Church of the Nazarene in Madera, California. We are a podcast that discusses the intersection of Scripture and our lives. Together, we continue the conversation that was started each preceding Sunday morning in our worship gathering.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick.
And I'm Natasha.
And we are the Living Vertizontal podcast with you this week to continue our conversation through the Gospel of Luke together. As a quick reminder, in our passage last week, we looked into Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 35. So finishing off Luke chapter 14, where we shifted from a couple of different Sabbath day encounters to an interaction that Jesus was having with crowds that were surrounding him. So these crowds that were beginning to build. Obviously, people want to see what he's doing. People want to hear what he's saying. And so people are coming from all around. Crowds are pushing in, and Jesus turns in and talks to them about the cost of discipleship, about what it means to follow. So people closing in, wanting to hear what he's going to say next. And instead of just turning to the religious elite or the establishment, he turns to all of them and says, I've got a word for everybody here. This is the cost. And so from this passage, we talked honestly about evaluating the cost of following Jesus in our own lives, from relationships to security and identity. We talked about how when we choose to follow Jesus, we are invited to bid farewell to all those things that we often cling to. In today's episode, we're going to press on into Luke chapter 15, verses 1 through 10, where we find Jesus still speaking to the crowds. But as he speaks, we hear two more of Jesus' parables. So, Natasha, would you read for us Luke chapter 15, verses 1 through 10?
Yes, Luke chapter 15, verse 1. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were gathering around to listen to Jesus. So the Pharisees and scribes began to grumble. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Then Jesus told them this parable. What man among you, if he has 100 sheep and loses one of them, does not leave the 99 in the pasture and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders, comes home, calls together his friends and neighbors to tell them, Rejoice with me, for I have found my lost sheep. In the same way, I tell you that there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous ones who do not need to repent. Or what woman who has 10 silver coins and loses one of them does not light a lamp, sweep her house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls together her friends and neighbors to say, Rejoice with me, for I have found my lost coin. In the same way, I tell you, there is joy in the presence of God's angels over one sinner who repents.
All right. Thank you for reading that for us today, Natasha. So let's just kind of jump right into the conversation. And as we do that, just again, it's important. This is a continuation of what has come immediately before this at the end of chapter 14, right? So it's still taking place, like I said, among those crowds. And even though it seems like there's a turn or a shift in specifically what Jesus is talking about, the scene is still the same. So we're in the midst of these crowds, and there we read that the tax collectors and sinners were gathering around to listen, right? And so that was the very first thing that stood out to me, because last week the passage that we were working in, chapter 14, verses 25 through 35, ends with this statement that we really didn't give much attention to in our podcast last week. But the statement is, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. This is right on the heels of what I identified as the appendage of the salt conversation that Jesus adds. Like, he talks about counting the cost, and then all of a sudden he throws in salt into this conversation. But we identified it wasn't an appendage. However, we didn't get to having a conversation about he who has ears to hear, let him hear. That does kind of feel like it's just left hanging. And it wasn't until I was working through the passage this week that I was like, oh my goodness, Luke knew what he was doing. he was very much so setting the stage for the conversation that would ensue as we move into chapter 15. So we read, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." And then in the very next verse, there are two groups of people that are identified. And what does Luke explain them as doing? They're gathering around to listen. And so it's almost like Luke is already, we'll get to what Jesus begins to say, right? In response to what the Pharisees say when they see these when they see these tax collectors and sinners beginning to gather. But it's as if Luke is maybe tipping his hand a little bit, maybe preparing the way for the conversation that Jesus is about to have through his parables, addressing this heart, this mindset that the Pharisees have. Because in my mind, I read, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." And then the tax collectors and sinners are the very next ones being brought up as the ones who are gathering to listen. It's like Luke is identifying, it's the tax collectors and the sinners who have ears to hear, and they are about to hear. And so just this painting this picture of the ones who are actually searching, the ones who are willing to listen, are maybe the ones that society wouldn't naturally expect.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I feel like when you think about the tax collectors and sinners from the perspective of the Pharisees and scribes, they're looking at them gathered around, and their perception is, Jesus just taught about counting the cost. These people didn't count the cost.
Right.
In fact, like they're so unrighteous. They're so unholy. They're less than. They're manipulating and abusive to our people. They're with the tax collectors, they're buddying up with the occupying empire. Like, how dare they? They're enemies of us. These people clearly did not count the cost. They are not in. And so this is their perception. Whereas on the other hand, they're like, Jesus, like, why are you wasting any time on them? I mean, after all, we did count the cost. We've done everything to serve them.
We've sacrificed. Yeah, we've given up everything. We've bid farewell to the life that we could have lived, and we've embraced this.
And so, Jesus, aren't we more valuable?
Yep.
Because we're righteous, right? And Jesus, it's like he hears their heart. They ask the question, they make the grumbles of the statement, the man welcomes sinners and eats with them, right? Grumbling to his disciples. But Jesus hears their heart. And these parables that follow, they address just that. And we'll get to some of the parables today, but then this also will continue into our conversation for next week.
Yeah. So before we get to the parables, that in verse 2, there was another word that stuck out to me. So verse 1 was the to listen, because I feel like it connected it to our passage last week and really set the stage well. But then in verse 2, the word that really stands out to me is this word grumble. What came to mind, or what did you think of, or even what did our midweek meditations kind of invite us to work through with that word grumble?
Well, on my first read through this, I immediately thought of the wilderness grumblings.
Yes, 100%.
And this might be because we spent a few years back, now it might have been 10 years ago, we spent a whole Bible study series, like a whole 8 weeks studying kind of these vices of the Israelites during their wandering.
Wilderness wandering.
And one of the things that we focused on was this idea of grumbling. And I don't remember if that was the exact word, but I do very much
complaining. I don't remember. Yeah.
I do very much remember this. And so when I read this, I was like, oh no, this is like the wilderness grumblings. Like God said, you're not supposed to do this. And so I think that's immediately what jumped into my mind. And then you brought up the midweek meditations. And as we began to kind of break into that, you see this
pattern
of grumbling really throughout kind of the Old Testament, though definitely majored on in Exodus, right? And the stories of the Exodus during that wilderness wandering period where, there's much complaining about the leadership, right? Complaining against Moses and Aaron. And that's all throughout Exodus, Numbers. It's even mentioned in the Psalms. And there was kind of, as I was looking more into this a little bit, in Exodus 16:8, it's kind of interesting because Exodus 16:8 says, your grumbling is not against us. So this is Moses speaking. Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord.
Right.
And I feel like when the Pharisees are sitting there talking to the disciples about what Jesus is doing, and they're grumbling.
Right.
It's like they're grumbling against the activity of God.
Yep.
And it's not that they're grumbling against Jesus or grumbling
As a
against the
person.
disciples,
Yeah.
right? They are grumbling
Yes.
against the work of God, because just as God led Moses and Aaron to do these actions as they were doing them in the Old Testament.
And even as God provided the manna, even as God provided the quail, even as God provided the water, like they would grumble in those things, right?
Yes.
They started grumbling about, still manna, still quail.
Yes, yeah. So in the same way, this grumbling is against this Jesus that God has provided as your Messiah, who is supposed to be here teaching you what it really means to live into God's kingdom.
Right.
And you're stuck in your grumbling. So just like the Israelites so long ago, your descendants so long ago, you're still sitting in that same place. And so while the Pharisees think that they're criticizing Jesus's behavior, they're really criticizing God's action in the world.
Yeah, so it's almost like they believe that what they are doing is from a righteous heart or a righteous position, when really it's coming from a place where they're just completely missing it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's crazy because it really does, like Luke in these first two verses sets up this very, very stark contrast between the tax collectors and sinners who are willing to listen and the religious establishment who is missing the activity of God and actually has a problem with the activity of God.
Yeah, almost like there's a dichotomy of those listening and those not really listening.
Right.
Because they're hearing everything, they're there, but it's not really clicking. It's not sinking in.
They're missing it. They're missing it completely. And, so the kind of stepping outside of the passage for a moment and thinking back to, the conversations that we had around our table on Tuesday evening when we looked at this passage, we talked about grumbling pretty heavily around the table. It seemed like that really landed for those of us that were sitting there. And it was brought up, very similar to what we've been saying, that grumbling often, when we choose to grumble, we find ourselves at danger, or when we choose to grumble, we find ourselves in danger of missing what God is trying to do or might be trying to do around us or in us or through us. So our grumbling very well could make us or those around us miss out on what God is trying to accomplish. And as we wrestled with that and talked about that some more, we began to recognize, man, grumbling is not just unbecoming, right? Because I think we could all agree, when you're sitting with a friend and that friend is always just complaining about stuff that's going on or grumbling about things, they're not necessarily the most fun to be around, right? They're kind of a downer in the situation. And that can be a bummer. However, when we recognize that the grumbling can actually result in us missing out on God's activity, we were like, oh man, this is really weighty. When we participate in grumbling or allow ourselves to continue to be present in the midst of grumbling, we begin to put ourselves in danger and at risk of missing out on what God is doing. And we don't want to do that. Like everybody around the table, we're like, well, I don't want to miss out on what God's doing. And so because I don't want to miss out on what God's doing, man, I need to make sure I continue to check myself. Lord, help me. Anytime I begin to find myself into like the routine or the rut of beginning to grumble, immediately call me out on it and work in me so that I don't miss it. And interestingly, on Sunday, as we were talking around our table, somebody that was there on Tuesday night and then at the table with me on Sunday morning brought up that very thing. Because on Tuesday they had committed. They're like, I have these things ahead of me and I know I'm going to be prone to grumble in them, but I don't want to miss out on what God's going to do. I don't want to miss out on being able to represent God well by not grumbling. And so I'm going to choose not to grumble right now. And I'm going to believe that Jesus is going to work with me in this and help me in this. And then he confessed on Sunday. He's like, well, I didn't outright grumble, but I did have some moments where I was really wanting to. And I think that anybody around me could have seen it on my face. And so it was almost like he acknowledged I was getting ready to, and then God brought it to my attention, and I was able to stop and not go full force into where I wanted to do, where I would have probably tended to go on my own way. And he talked about just how freeing it was when he recognized that Jesus helped him through that time where he would have gone full force into grumbling. He felt the Holy Spirit with him, helping him pump the brakes and slow down so that he didn't miss out on what God was trying to accomplish in him, through him, and around him.
Yeah, I think it's a good practice for those of us who, many people kind of fall into two camps. Either you're a glass half full type of person,
sure,
or a glass half empty type of person. And if you happen to fall into the latter, you tend to be very, very critical of most things around you, which can be very helpful, right? It can help us move from a one position to an improved position. However, that mentality also lends itself more heavily to this issue of grumbling. And so I think for those people, if you're in that camp, which I definitely myself am, if you're in that camp, I think it's a good exercise for us to just every time that we catch ourselves starting to fall into that temptation of grumbling, work out a deal with Jesus. Jesus, help convict me. And then in that moment, take a second and say, oh, Jesus, okay, I heard you. And okay, where are you at work in this? Mm-hmm. Where can I see you in this moment? Right. So that we don't miss that opportunity. And maybe it serves just our very inclination to grumble begins to serve as, we talk about speed bumps a lot. Maybe that serves as that speed bump to slow us down and say, whoa, I don't want to go down that road. Okay, Jesus, where are you at? What are you doing?
Yep.
And that might be, it's been something I've been trying to work on. Definitely like the person you were describing from the group, definitely not getting it 100%, but a practice that I'm hoping that will begin to shift and shape my tendency to jump into that critical spirit and then, really travel down a road that misses out on a lot of the things that Jesus is doing and probably costs me opportunity to participate in those things as well.
Sure. So I think it's now appropriate that we can kind of push on into the parables that we have. And just before we get to discussing them, just remember, we always like to keep this in front of us. Parables serve a purpose. A parable is meant to illustrate, expose, and evoke. So as we are reading these parables, as we're talking through them, let's remember to keep those things in mind. What is being illustrated? What is it exposing? And what is it calling for? What is it trying to evoke within the people here that are listening, but also ultimately within us as we hear this so many years later? So the first parable that we come to is the parable of the lost sheep. And so with that, obviously you've already read it, and so instead of just restating what happens in the story, what stood out to you as you worked through this first parable, the parable of the lost sheep?
Well, one of the things that I think is remarkable here is that Jesus, when he's telling this parable of the shepherd and the sheep, the sheep are just the sheep. Jesus, the shepherd, sees one group. He sees just the sheep. This is in contrast to the Pharisees, who really are seeing two groups, right? They see the righteous and the unrighteous, you know, and so they would have the righteous sheep and the unrighteous sheep, and
the 99 who stayed, they're the righteous, good ones.
The good sheep and the bad sheep. Whereas Jesus really sees one group. He sees is sheep who need God's mercy. It's just that some know it and some don't. And so I feel like that just completely evens the playing field from a perspective, just going right into this parable. And when you begin to see yourself as just a sheep and you see the sinner as just the sheep and you see the really wicked person as just the sheep and you see the ignorant as just the sheep, then all of a sudden, when you look around, there can't be stratification or judgment like what the Pharisees are trying to levy here.
Right.
It's just all sheep. It's just some know that they need Jesus's mercy and some aren't aware of it yet.
When you say that, you look back to the end of verse 2 and the complaint that the Pharisees levy at Jesus or towards Jesus is, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them.
How dare?
How dare he? And in this time, I mean, eating with somebody was a big deal.
Right.
Eating with somebody said, I see you as valuable. Eating with somebody said that I accept you. I value you. I want to be part of you, and I want you to be part of me. Like there was, when I was looking into it, the word covenant actually came up, where it's like you're entering into this covenant type relationship with this person that you're sitting down to eat with. And so the Pharisees have a problem because Jesus is sitting down and eating with sinners because they have two different groups in mind.
Mm-hmm.
They have the unrighteous lost, and they have the righteous 99 who are still there. And they have these two groups. But the crazy thing is, and it wasn't until you were bringing this up that I think Jesus brought it to my mind, is so Jesus is accused of eating with the sinners here. But just a couple of weeks ago, we were reading about how he was at the leading Pharisee's house for a Sabbath meal. So he was also eating with them there. And I feel like it's like a undercover working out of exactly what you just explained, where Jesus just sees one group, all sheep, all in need of a shepherd. Whether they're the 99 who are staying together, who haven't wandered away, or the one who has wandered away, it doesn't really matter. They're all still sheep. And he cares for each and every single one of them. He values each and every single one of them. He is still the shepherd of each and every single one of them because they are his flock, whether they're the ones who have remained or wandered away. He sees one group, they see two. And I feel like there's just a perfect like working out of that even here.
Yeah. And, I think the temptation as humans is to, when people mistreat us or people do things to harm us or to harm others around us, it's really easy for us to look at our fellow sheep and say, how wicked, how unrighteous, how evil, how dare you do that? But when we remember that we're all of one group, you really have to take a step back and think, who is the true enemy here? Who is attacking the prey? Who are the wolves? Because the sheep, sometimes we treat as wolves, our fellow sheep. We look at them that way. And the reality is that they are not the enemy.
Right.
We have an enemy, and our enemy gains footholds in our fellow sheep's lives and then leads them away, leads them astray. And so when we see them in that light and we see them as no longer the enemy, but rather like, this is God's beloved, this is part of my pack, these are my people, then all of a sudden our focus for the wrong and the injustice in the world shifts from our fellow sheep or our fellow man toward where it should actually be placed. And that is the enemy of God. And so we really want to keep that in mind, because I think it helps us to love better like God loves. When we see others, when we see our fellow sheep in the same light that God sees them as those who have been led astray, I just think that it helps us reorient and refocus, and then we can better be a reflection of God and better emulate the kingdom, the accepting kingdom that he wants us to be a part of.
Sure. And as you were saying that, a thought came to my mind is I could only imagine maybe there's some people out there who would hear what you just said and say something like, but Pastor Natasha, doesn't Scripture actually warn us about looking out for the wolves in sheep's clothing? And the thing is, with what you were just explaining, like we need to remember who the wolf is actually. Like, oh man, maybe that's not actually talking about people, but maybe that's actually talking about the enemy of God, who is Satan, who is trying to put people on to disguise himself as a sheep in the form of somebody else. But if we recognize, no, humanity is created in the image of God, so my fellow man and woman around me, like they are image bearers of God. Now, there might be brokenness in their life. There might be tendencies that they have where the enemy is using them to try to steal, kill, and destroy. But the truth of the matter is that person is still a person. That person is still a sheep who God himself is in pursuit of. And so that completely changes our perspective. It made me think of back into the Old Testament with Gideon. I don't remember the exact details because this is just coming to me as we're talking about it. But the words that are used when it's like Gideon in the power of God accomplishes something, the specific Hebrew words that are used are more like God put Gideon on to go to war. So it was God in action in Gideon. And so in the same way as we think about this like wolf in sheep's clothing, perhaps the enemy of our soul at times tries to put us on in order to steal, kill, and destroy. And we need to be aware of that, yes, but that doesn't mean when we look at another one of God's creation sitting around us, we say that's a wolf. No. They themselves are not a wolf. They themselves are a sheep. Now, there might be a wolf trying to take residence within them so they can reap destruction, but they themselves are not the enemy.
They're really just a sheep in need of God's deliverance.
100%. Just like me.
Right.
Just like me. There's one group.
One group. And, I think when we come with this mentality, when the lost sheep is found, then we can understand the response of joyfully putting it on our shoulders and going home, right? When I read this passage through the first time, this part really stood out to me. The shepherd's response was, and when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders. And I thought about being a parent. Mm-hmm. And I thought about the number of times when, and it's not like my child is coming home, every time, like it's not like they wandered really far astray, right. But every time we miss it, right? That's a little wandering, right? Yep. Every time we sin, every time we do something outside of God's perfect plan, like that's a little bit of wandering that we do. And so I'm envisioning this like with my kids. And when they do a little bit of wandering, my first inclination when they come back is rarely to joyfully put them on my shoulders and carry them home.
Right. Yep.
And I recognize I'm not the shepherd. I am a sheep that is, supposed to kind of care for these other sheep, right? But in this image, I feel like I have a few shepherd-like responsibilities 100%. In the lives of my kids, or really in the lives of anybody we're discipling. Mm-hmm. And when they wander a little, when they miss it a little, when we miss it a little, what would it be like for us to meet the repentance or meet the conviction they express with joy instead of further reprimanding or further, trying to express a point of just how wrong what they did was? What if we celebrated that and praised them for that and built that up and commended them and joyfully put them on our shoulders and carried them home? And that just held so much conviction for me over this last week, working through this passage, to not just focus on the scolding, but really, really major on the rejoicing of repentance, just as the shepherd does for me. I need to model that for my children. So that way, when they think of their father, right, they get to see that lived out in their earthly parents too.
Yeah. In an extension of that conversation, because I would definitely agree that like joyfully putting on the shoulders conversation was something that was very convicting for me as well. But in extension to that, the other piece that I feel like was very convicting to me was the shepherd's actions when he returns, when he gets back. It's not just all right, go back to the other 99. It's good that you're here. But it's like this seemingly exaggerative response where it's like he is calling his neighbors, his friends, his family. He's calling everybody he knows and even maybe cold calling some random people. And he's like, hey, you got to come on over. We've got to celebrate because the one that was lost is now found. And just this over the top celebration. for the return of the one. For me, that was also convicting. Not that I don't get the sense that the shepherd is being fake in this. Like the shepherd is filled with that much joy that this one has returned because they are that valuable to them. This one is home, and I need to celebrate. And it was very convicting to think, man, when was the last time I've been that excited about that? And then I actually, it was over the last couple of weeks, I feel like Jesus has been challenging me about the excitement that we ought to be able to find and have when people start getting it, when people start following him on a moment by moment basis, when maybe not in every way, but when you recognize, man, that was a moment where they totally saw Jesus and they followed after him. Let's celebrate that. I feel like over the last few weeks, that's been something that I've been being challenged on. And there's a part of me, because I'm not necessarily always the most excited when I see that felt like, man, people are going to think I'm being fake about this. But within me, there genuinely was this overwhelming sense of joy when I was like, that is it. That is exactly what this is about. This is so exciting to see that you decided to talk to Jesus on your way into Lowe's. Like, that's what this is about. In the middle of things that seem to not even matter, where it's like, I'm not having to make a decision between life and death situations, or like, do I move across the country or do I stay here? I'm just on my way to the hardware store. And to have the thought of, I want to talk to Jesus about what I'm going into. It's not these crazy life-altering decisions that are about to be made, but this individual decided to talk to Jesus about that. That is exactly it. That is it. That's what it looks like to follow Jesus with every moment of our lives. That's what it looks like to live as Jesus lived, where you don't do anything or say anything without first listening to your Father and seeing him do it. That is what's being embodied here. And over these last couple of weeks, I have found an overwhelming sense of joy when I begin to identify those things happening. And so it was convicting, but also reassuring in the sense that, man, I look back over my life and I've not had that level of excitement, but lately it's been growing within me and I'm excited about that. But I also feel a little weird about that because it's not been something that's so natural to me, but it's like Jesus here, even in this moment, as I was reading it, yes, some conviction, but also a lot of encouragement of like, no, that's how I respond. Nick, you're getting it. You're getting it. This should be exciting. This should fill you with an overwhelming amount of joy to see people do that, because it fills me with joy. And that's exciting. And I'm even just getting excited talking about it right here, right now. Okay, so as we push on, like let's continue on. Definitely, let's be excited. But let's see what else he says. There's two parables here that we hear from Jesus. So what's going on in this second parable with the parable of the lost coin?
So actually, this one was fun with the kids. So the kids, as we jumped into this second parable, they were questioning. They were like, well, why in the world would it matter if you lost a coin? I mean, they're thinking of like a penny. That's what they're equating this to. And they're like, I wouldn't clean my bedroom for a penny. And like, these are the comments that they're saying. Why? This doesn't make sense. Yeah. Why would they do that? And so we dug in together in a little bit of the context. And so when you look into this parable in particular, you begin to learn that the 10 coins were likely, most scholars believe, though we don't know for sure, that these were probably a part of a headpiece or necklace that was a traditional part of the dowry that would have been given at a marriage. And so loss of this suggested more than just loss of a coin. It's loss of something sentimental, yes, but also identity, standing, security, because this dowry could be sold in the event that something happens, right, to destabilize her new home. Maybe her husband passes or something, but this gives her something that provides assurance and security,
a level of security,
in the marriage. And so when you begin to recognize this, the kids were like, oh, so it's like she lost her wedding ring. And I was like, okay, kind of. So now we're kind of on the
Maybe?
same page.
Yeah,
So,
getting closer.
but the value is there. And,
Yes.
and so then we started to talk about, well, couldn't you just go buy a new wedding ring? Well, you could. It would be very expensive, but I guess you could, but no, because that's not actually the wedding ring.
Right.
That's not the real one. That's not the one I really want. I want the original one, right? And that it has this value, this infinite worth that cannot be replaced. And I was like, yes, we're there, right? So the kids are understanding that this coin that is lost represents something of infinite value.
Right.
And that's exactly how Jesus, the shepherd, sees his sheep. And likewise, it's exactly how the woman here sees this missing coin. It's of infinite value. And back then, I mean, the houses, we think of houses sweeping our house today. That's not such a huge endeavor. You flip on the light switch, you pull out the broom and you sweep, and hopefully, you
Right.
find it. But this is like you light a lamp, which involves a whole bunch of different things. Right? You
Trimming
gotta trim
wicks, you got oil that you got to make
heaven
sure
forbid,
you have
you got to go refill the oil.
Right.
I mean, like then you got to actually start the fire, right? And so
Yes.
this is not like an easy task either. So you've got all of these things that you have to do just to turn on the light.
Yeah.
And then once you get that done, now you're talking about a floor that is likely made of dirt.
It's an earthen floor. Yeah, more than
and
likely.
So we've got a dirt floor here, and she's sweeping the dirt floor. So this is now somebody who's looking in a sandbox for
Yes.
a wedding ring.
Exactly.
Like that's what you have. This is the image that's here. And God is willing to do this for us.
Yeah.
He's willing to get down on his hands and knees in a dimly lit room to search through a sandbox to find something of infinite worth. And as we were talking about this with the kids, I just feel like the imagery of that was so beautiful and so powerful. When we really begin to realize how big God's love is for every single one. For me, yes, but also for those who I would look at and say, that might be my enemy, but that person's not nice. And so it's such a powerful, moving picture to look at this parable in that way.
Yeah. I think for me, the thing that stands out is when you hold the parables next to each other. The main difference, I mean, there is the difference of, which we did this in the midweek meditations. There was a table where we got to compare and contrast them, like the similarities, the differences. Obviously, there's a difference of the first parable involves a man who is a shepherd. The second parable involves a woman who has lost this coin, right? So you have a way for the men in the crowd to access what Jesus is talking about, and a way for the women in the crowd to access and understand what Jesus is talking about. So that's one difference. But then the other really glaring difference is the fact that the first story is 1 out of 100 has gone missing. And in the second story, 1 out of 10 has gone missing. So there's like this increase in value compared to the other, if that makes any sense, that is happening between these two stories. And so there's a difference there, but then it got us around our table on Sunday to ask the question of, okay, so we see this difference. So 1 is 1 out of 100, 1 is 1 out of 10. Everybody at our table, for the most part, was like, I think 99 is still more important than 1. And so, like, if I'm just thinking through this pragmatically in my own life, I'm not going to risk even losing 5 of the 99 because I go after that 1. It's not a good business decision to make. The thing that remains the same is the response and the actions of the shepherd and of the woman, right? When one thing goes missing, regardless of its value in comparison to the rest of the group, the immediate response is to go searching for that thing. And then the continued action of the individual remains the same, right? So not only do they immediately begin to search until they find it, but when they find it, they celebrate it. They celebrate in the same way by contacting everybody that they can, whipping out the phone book or scrolling through their phone book, and Nobody uses a phone book anymore. Scrolling through their contacts and calling everybody, sending out a mass text message saying, come party. Kind of reminds me of the movie Home. It's a cartoon and our kids love it. But one of the Boov, the whole story is predicated on this moment where the Boov is trying to, this particular one named O is trying to invite people to his house party. And he sends out an invitation, and he doesn't just send an invitation to the fellow Boov, he sends out an invitation to the entire galaxy. Everybody. Like, that is what these people are doing. That's what the shepherd is doing. That is what the woman is doing. They are sending out an invitation to come party with me, because what once was lost is now found, and this valuable thing has come back, and we are made whole again. And so maybe that's where we need to bring this to a close this week is, remembering back to the purpose of a parable is to illustrate, to expose, and to evoke. And it seems like maybe Jesus is working to expose within us a heart that's reluctant to participate in the search and to see the exceeding value of everybody, right? To see everybody as part of one group. Maybe we tend to be a little bit more like the Pharisees, where we see an us versus them. But Jesus is inviting us this week. There is no us, there is no them. It is just we, the flock, the sheep. Some of them are not where they should be. Some of them aren't where you are, but all of you are the same. So maybe this week we're hearing this invitation to recognize everybody as part of this one group. Or maybe we're hearing an invitation to participate in the celebration of when we see somebody get it, or when we ourselves get it. Like, actually take joy, because the truth is, Jesus is celebrating the moments where we get it and we follow after him and we respond to him in obedience. He's celebrating. We should too. The moments when somebody else, when we recognize obedience in the lives of other people around us, we should be celebrating. When I see my son or my daughter do something in obedience to or in pursuit of Jesus, like, I should be celebrating that. That is not something to be swept under the rug and ignored or just kind of glossed over. These are things that are worthy of celebration, because even he is celebrating, not just he, right? All of heaven is celebrating in that way. And so maybe this week we hear these parables and we hear Jesus's invitation to see everybody equally, right? And to celebrate excessively.
As you journey with us through the Gospel of Luke, we recommend purchasing Midweek Meditations, A Journey Through Luke, Part 5, which is available for purchase on Amazon. Also, be sure to follow the Living Vertizontal podcast to stay current on all our new releases. To learn more about the Church at Riverstone, visit us at thechurchatriverstone.org.